This is Luke Gibbons.
And this is Elizabeth Guzman Arroyo.
And you are listening to Colonized Minds podcast. We made it through rain, sleet, snow, a snowstorm, technical difficulties, a ban on Muslims at the airport. After all that, we're back.
With the podcast.
With the podcast, yes. So, yeah, what's going on?
I don't know. I was going to ask you the same thing.
I know. There's so much that's going on. This has been a crazy day. Well, it's been a crazy start of the term. Let me just say that. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on. Like there's a Muslim ban. So for those who don't know the specifics, the new executive order, which I think is the title is fabulous. Protecting the nation from foreign terrorist entry into the United States. Executive order is actually the full name. I read it like twice now. So essentially what it does is it puts a 90-day suspension on travelers from Iran, Iraq, Sudan, Somalia, Yemen, Libya, and Syria. But it also completely suspends basically asylum seekers for 120 days. And then at 30, 60, 90, and 120 days, the State Department, the National Security Director, and the Department of Homeland Security are going to be submitting reports, again, at 30, 60, 90, and 120 days. So during that whole period where they're not allowing folks to come in, essentially what they're doing is they are connecting supposedly with those countries. They're also connecting with other countries to find out what information they provide in the screening process. And then at the end of that period of time, and through all this, they're submitting reports supposedly to the president. So once all of that is done, they will supposedly have this, I guess, a database of what information does Yemen provide when their citizens are seeking asylum, or they have citizens who are now trying to get a green card here in the United States. What information does Libya, Syria? So anyway, all the information that those individuals provide, and then there's a decision that's going to be made about whether or not they're providing enough information. So if there's this thought that, let's say, one of these countries is not providing adequate information for us to conduct screening, then we will continue to stick with that ban on that particular country. We could also increase the countries that are going to be on that list, so we may add a few more. But if at the end of that period of time, we feel like those countries are providing adequate information, the idea would be then that they are supposed to be removed from that list. But when all this is kind of said and done at the end of, I believe it's the 90-day period, the other interesting thing is that they will change the cap. So they will cap, I believe it'll be 50,000 people who will be granted essentially like the asylum, being able to come in through the legal process. They'll cap it at 50,000 this year, which I believe last year it was 87,000, something like that. So just kind of a basic of what that is. But however, I will also add that it prioritizes refugee claims made by individuals on the basis of religion or religious persecution. So if their religion is in the minority in the country of their nationality. So if part of the reason people are thinking that it's a veiled Muslim ban is that if you look at the countries that are being, I guess, targeted on this list and the predominant religion there, one might think that you're giving preferential treatment to folks who are not of that religion, which would be Muslim for some of those cases. So anyway, just figured we provide some clarification.
You know, there's a lot of issues with this that are raised. But one of the things that I kept seeing over and over and over online was folks who had left the U.S. to go and visit one of these countries.
Or have permanent residencies.
Right? Have a visa legally, are able to come and be in the United States. Left to go to one of these countries, either for study abroad, for vacation, to visit someone there, work, whatever the case may be, right? And attempted to come back, and they were detained and not allowed to come back.
Yeah.
And one of the ones that I remember very much so was a young woman who has actually been living here for over a decade, owns a home here, has a job, has a puppy. She mentioned that. And she was just going abroad for vacation, essentially. And she was really excited about her vacation. And then as soon as she got there, she started hearing about rumors of this potential executive order. And then the executive order was signed. And that same day, she bought a ticket back home through Dubai, actually, from the country she was in, then Dubai, and then here. And at the Dubai airport, she was actually asked to get off the plane.
Wow.
And said that she could not go back into the U.S. because of the executive order. So the issue with that is, what does she do with her house now that she owns? What about her job that's expecting her to get back in a couple of days, right? Her puppy that's waiting for her to come and feed her, or to take her from whoever's taking care of the puppy. Like, this is very much affecting a lot of people's lives that just have ordinary day-to-day lives, are trying to get an education, have, jobs, have family obligations. So with the executive orders going on, there's a heightened fear, in a sense. There was already heightened fear as of January 20th.
Yeah.
And very soon after, it just continuously gets higher and higher.
The other thing I think about, with that fear is latent consequences. So there's what we are intending to do, and then there's what the stuff that happens that we may not be anticipating, but some people already are. So the person you mentioned, you have people who can't get back into the country, and many of these are PhD students. These are folks in graduate school, international students. So like, what happens to those individuals? But then what is going to happen to individuals, not even just the whole 30, 60, 90 days while this moratorium's in place, the next really 3 or 4 years, if I'm an international student who does biomedical research or works in the tech industry, I seriously have to consider whether or not I come to the US, right? To study.
Right.
I might now be looking at Canada to go study, or I may be looking at Germany to go study. So that I also think there's an intellectual drain that
there is very much an intellectual drain. And then for those of us working in higher ed, we know that a huge amount of inflow to funding higher ed is actually from international students.
Absolutely. International students pay a lot more in tuition. Right now, at a place like a PCC, we have a sizable international population, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's a majority. I wouldn't say we are financially dependent on international students. I know of colleges and universities that are incredibly financially dependent on the additional tuition that our international students pay. I really got to wonder what the budget people are doing, what the finance folks are doing.
Oh, yeah.
Funding is already being cut. Then you have this other funding source that looking like I may not necessarily go there. I'll go to Oxford. I'll go somewhere else now.
Right. And I mean, it's not only affecting higher ed, but also if we're just talking just about international students, those international students come and spend money on tuition. But guess what? They also spend money on housing, on food, on entertainment, transportation, everything else. It's actually a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think about these, again, ripple effects. I think about these other tech companies, right? So we stay in an area of the country where tech is really big, and they bring a lot of folks from overseas to do a lot of work, really good paying work. Yeah, even if I'm not necessarily Muslim, but if I come from a certain country, I may not want to necessarily come to the States, because then I may feel like I'm trapped here. I may not be able to bring the rest of my family here. This is creating a lot of instability, so I don't necessarily know what's going to happen over the next year, 2, 3 years. So kind of why do I take that job offer here to do your tech work when I can link up with a company in England or Germany or France somewhere? Or I can go to, Korea or Tokyo, and I don't have to worry about the same level of instability.
Mm-hmm.
So all that to say, I think there's some interesting ripple effects that are being created. And I think that, if nothing else, I think this highlights what happens when you rush into making a decision. We can always Monday morning quarterback a decision. I think it's very easy to do that, right? Someone makes a decision, you can look back later on and kind of go, well, you should have done this, should have done this, should have done this. But this definitely seems like a very rushed decision.
Very much so.
That wasn't very well thought out. So the thing I find most fascinating about the new executive order was how it was signed and the consultation that went behind it. So if folks do not know, this is what the New York Times is reporting, that General John Kelly, who, if you don't know, is the Secretary of Homeland Security, that is a pretty important job. It's also pretty important considering if you're restricting immigration, Homeland Security might have a hand in enforcing that. So apparently on Friday, when the executive order was being signed, General Kelly was actually on a conference call talking about how to implement this ban, which at that point was just an idea. As he is on the phone talking with other intelligence folks, someone says, and I quote, "Look up at the television. The president is signing the executive order we're discussing." So literally, the intelligence folks had not even finished discussing and coming up with a plan for this when it was signed. If nothing else, I find that fascinating.
You would think that normally you'd want to get the folks that are actually going to be implementing this order on board, get their feedback of how it could be implemented or what are potential blocks, etc. Mm-hmm. What are illegalities, right? Like what can you do, what can't you do based off our laws?
Yes.
But no.
So again, to me, it doesn't matter what end of the political spectrum you're on. It doesn't matter if you're pro or against or anti-Trump. To me, that doesn't matter, is of no concern. What I do have a bit of an issue with, and I think is really interesting, is I think it's problematic that one of the top people in law enforcement, in Homeland Security, is finding out about this executive order on TV. So if you didn't catch that, that's essentially what happened. He is on a conference call trying to figure this out and how it's going to be implemented, those little pesky things like details, and he finds out that it is actually happening. Fascinating stuff. Frighteningly, that's my new term, frighteningly fascinating. So right now, Muslims are the group that people talk about, and there's a lot of fear that some people have. Now, when you broaden your friend circle, when you broaden your peer group, those types of fears go away. So people who consider themselves maybe a little more progressive don't feel that same sense of fear. But basically, folks who are Muslim, that is kind of like the new group. The Pew Research Center actually did a study, and they looked back over the decades about how welcoming us as Americans, this country of immigrants, this country that very much prides itself on our open arms and ability to our desire to want to bring people in and give folks the opportunity. So they went back actually, and they looked at different immigrant groups, and they looked at polls of how people felt about them. So in 1968, they looked at Hungarians and asked folks whether or not they would approve of allowing Hungarian refugees in who escaped communism. 55% of Americans disapproved. In 1979, they classified Indo-Chinese, and they asked whether or not folks would approve or disapprove of folks coming from, as they call it, Indochina. Again, escaping the regime there. 62% of people disapproved of allowing, and it was 14,000 people right? 14,000 a month they were letting in. In the 1980s, Cuban refugees. Remember, like Cuba, communists, like we didn't have great relationships with them. Well, they asked Americans whether or not they approved of allowing Cubans into the country in the 1980s. 71% of people said that they did not approve. In 1999, ethnic Albanians, remember Kosovo and what was going on there? They asked folks whether or not they would be accepting or they would approve of letting those folks into the country. Only 66% of people said that they supported it. So 30% of the population opposed it. So anyway, why am I saying all this? I'm saying all this to say, as a country that prides itself on freedom and liberty and diversity, and this being a country of immigrants, if we look throughout our history, we've typically not been that compassionate, and it's always been veiled under the guise of security. It's interesting that this same thing is being done, and it's being done under the veil of security, and for some interesting reason, people don't necessarily put those things together.
Right.
There's not a connecting of the historical dots.
Right.
But I don't know. I think it's interesting. Like, so I like, again, dealing in facts and looking at things, and I like being able to kind of look at historically, like what we've done.
Right. What our patterns have been.
And so it's just really interesting that we look at those things sometimes and we feel like, oh man, that was so long ago. That was so far away. And yet, like, is it really? Because we don't necessarily learn from our mistakes. And when your group gets theirs, when your group gets it's, is that how you say it? Anyway, you don't necessarily have the same compassion for the next group as you wish people had for you. Mm-hmm. So I also think that's incredibly interesting. That I would imagine there are probably people who are of the very same backgrounds, whether that is Hungarian, whether that is Cuban, whether those are folks from Kosovo. I would imagine you probably have people who are in those groups who were discriminated against, who most Americans at the time didn't approve of them coming here, who probably also support the current ban. Not all, but I would imagine you would find folks within those groups who support that ban. Yeah. So, again, I just think it's fascinating. So what do we have coming up this week?
For those of y'all who missed it, we actually just released a new vlog yesterday.
Yeah.
So this is the second vlog. It's our edutainment vlog series for the winter term. And so we're really just talking about different topics or issues that are really critical and important to our PCC community. The first one was on food insecurity, and the second one is on incident reporting. So if you've been experiencing harassment, discrimination, or bias, there's a way to report that, and there's a procedure that gets followed. So that's what this vlog that was released yesterday talks about.
And we got a lot of really cool, interesting topics that we're going to be talking about in the vlogs. So yeah, I'm really excited about that. The other thing is, I don't know if people know, but it's February. Mm-hmm. So it's Black History Month. Just putting that out. I would encourage everyone to Google Carter G. Woodson. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, The Miseducation of the Negro, I think it should be like required reading, like in high school. I think you should have to read it. If you are listening to my voice and you have not read Miseducation of the Negro, please go read it. If nothing else, Google Carter G. Woodson. Yes. So I just need to throw that out there because I think it's important. Given that it's February, given that there's going to be a lot of celebration, given most of my friends who do a lot of like equity and inclusion work and talking they're getting paid a lot of money in February. Like, if you're like a Black speaker, this is rent money right here. This is when you get for the year. Yes, because they don't want to talk to you in March. So get it all late January, like between King's birthday, King holiday, and the end of February is when you get all that money. Yeah. Because no one cares about Black history in March. Is that bad to say?
It's not necessarily bad to say. It's just kind of...
Is that wrong to say?
Morbid. Like, it shouldn't be that way.
It shouldn't be that way.
Right? Like,
Yeah.
we should be celebrating Black history every day, just like we should be celebrating all history, really, every
Women's
day.
history,
Right.
history of Native peoples.
Except that as a society, historically, that has never happened, right? It's like siloed into very specific time frames, and that's the only time.
Yeah.
And then it gets forgotten.
And people will question, well, like, why is there Black history? Why is there not such and such history? Why is there not blah, blah, blah? Go back to the other comment that I made. Read the Miseducation of the Negro. There's a lot of stuff about Black history and the history of marginalized people that will be explained if people would simply read those books. That's why, like, typically, like, when someone, you're like, well, what about this history? Like, one of the first questions I ask is, like, have you heard of Carter G. Woodson? Have you ever read Miseducation of the Negro? No? Then we shouldn't continue this conversation. Yeah. You don't have what you need to continue this conversation.
Right.
So we're gonna end it right here. So anyway, that's why I say read the book. There's a lot of stuff that would make sense. There's a lot of stuff that would make sense about, why we celebrate it in February, but why it needs to be celebrated all year long.
Right.
Yeah.
So then next week, we also have on the 13th, on February 13th, a workshop, and it's going to be focused on internalized depression and what's the healing process for internalized depression. It's actually going to be led by Araceli Cruz, who we brought out earlier in the term as well.
Yeah.
So for anyone interested in it, please attend. It'll be during Common Hour from 1 to 2.
So we got a lot of good stuff coming on in February and this month and this week. So a lot of exciting stuff that's going on, especially during Common Hour.
All right. Well, I think that is all for now. This has been Elizabeth Guzman Arroyo.
This is Luke Gibbons saying, so what if it's true?